Quarter 4, Module 13, entitled Drawing Conclusions about Population Proportion Based on Test Statistic Value and Rejection Region. For this module, you are expected to first compute for the test statistic of population proportion. Second is differentiate critical value approach from p-value approach of hypothesis testing, and draw conclusion on population proportions based on the test statistic and rejection region. So in conducting a study, the last part of the process is drawing conclusions, and it should be done correctly and carefully. In doing so, you need to learn how to consider necessary data as your basis and follow different steps. On the previous lessons, you were already taught how to compute test statistic concerning population proportions, as well how to determine the rejection or the non-rejection region by using an illustration on the curve. So this time, we will give decision kung mag-reject ba ta or dili. So in drawing conclusions, there are two different approaches that you may apply. The critical Z approach, or using the computed Z value, and the p-value approach. Usually, ang atong na-discuss previously katupang sa population mean pang hypothesis testing, critical value approach. But this time, i-present na ko pahapyaw ang p-value approach because sa inyong research, pag-abot ninyo o grade 12 pohon, usually manggod ang mga software, statistical software uses p-value approach. So at least familiar lang mo. So, but before tamo to sa p-value approach, discussan natin si critical value approach. In applying the first approach, which is determining the critical value, which you were already taught in the previous modules, you need to consider the following. Similar actually ang process katong hypothesis testing gani involving population mean. Similar lang ang process actually. The first one is to determine the null and alternative hypothesis. Ang dere gisingitan lang niya is to determine the level of significance. Letter C is compute the test statistic, critical value, including the rejection region, and letter D is to decide whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. So, how will you decide? So, determine if the test statistic falls in the rejection region. If it does, reject the null hypothesis. If it does not, do not reject the null hypothesis. So, kana kung nagamit ka og graph niya or katong illustration sa normal curve. Pero kung ang value ang atong i-consider, kani po din mong basihan. If the computed Z statistic is greater than or less than the tabular value, reject the null hypothesis. Basically, ang same gyapon katong sa ato ang hypothesis testing gani example, kato gani ang Z computed, ang absolute value niya is greater than or equal to the Z tab or katong critical value, diha ka mag-reject. Ang computed Z statistic gani is if the computed Z statistic is greater than or ang absolute value niya, ang absolute value sa imong Z statistic is greater than or equal to the absolute value sa imong Z tab nimo, you reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, do not reject the null hypothesis. So, in ato lang ang imuhang bantayanan. So, that is kung mag-compare ka og value. Pero kung sa graph, dali na lang man siya. Kung ang Z statistic gani falls in the rejection region, so reject. If the computed Z statistic does not fall in the rejection region, then do not reject. Nga na lang kasimple. So, example ta. Sa kaninga example, presented na ang given. So, given nga P is equivalent to, null hypothesis na to is P is equals to 0.85. Alternative na to is P is less than 0.85. So, basically, from this pa lang, kabalo na ta nga, kung saan nga test, gamito na to. Less than man siya. So, left tail ta nga test. So, based sa atong alternative hypothesis. So, natay alpha nga 0.01. Tapos, given tag mga x na to is 325, natay p 0.85, n na to is 400. So, from that, we will now compute the test statistic. So, to solve for the test statistic, since wala pa tayo p hat, kailangan sa nato isolve sa p hat using the formula x divided by n. Ang x nato is 325 divided by ang sample size nato ng 400. So therefore our p hat or the sample proportion nato is 0.81. So since nato yung p hat, we can now solve the z statistic using the formula. Or again, katong p hat minus p over square root of p times q over n. So, pwede na. So, given naman tag p hat, na-solve na nato si p hat, that's 0.81, tapos ang p na to is 0.85, tapos, ang dire, 1 minus 0.85 over 400. Then, isolve na lang. Di na kahit nato elaborate, ang point lang na, i-minus ni, pagkauman kanipod, i-minus, using calculator, i-times, tapos i-divide, common square root, tapos i-divide na po. So, therefore, if you follow the step, you should come up with the answer na ang z is equivalent to negative 2.24. Next, since nanatay z, we need this time ang atong critical value para makumparahan. So, since one-tailed test siya, specifically left-tailed test kay less than atong kuan, ang atoang alternative hypothesis, we will use the table, left-tailed, nara. Tapos ang atong alpha man is 0.01, nara. So, ang intersection nila kani, negative 2.33. Ang problema, kani nga module pod, lahi pod yang gigamit. Kani mangong table na to, naka-round off ni. So, para uniform ta again, i-follow na lang nato ang kaning sa table na lang. So, dapat critical value na to is negative 2.33. Anyway, approximately, kung imong magpud ning i-round off, 2.33 man po. So, again, for uniformity, follow itong kaning nga table. Katong previous na itong ang ginagamit na table. So, atong critical value is 2.33. Okay. So, after na, decide na kakaron. So, depende sa kung unsay kuan nimo. So, let's say, kung gamit ka og normal curve, dire is 0 sa to nga, kung sa to atong ang computed na to, negative 2.24. Ang negative 2.24 na dire. So, negative 1 na diya, negative 2, negative 3. So, na dire si 2.24. Computed na to. But, our 2.33 man ato ang kuan, negative 2.33. So asa na banda? 2.24. Na diri si 2.33. So napa sa unahan. So if you can see, since the computed test statistic na negative 2.24 na ara man na diri, wala kaabot sa diri nga test statistic na to, so you should not reject the null hypothesis. Or kung kumparahon na to, ang absolute value sa negative 2.24 compared to our 2.33, absolute value sa negative 2.23, kisa may mas dako. Di ba mas dako maning diri? So therefore, less than siya, so do not reject because pag mag-compare ka, ang greater than or equal man ka mag-reject the null hypothesis. Kung less than, do not reject man ka the null hypothesis. Kumantoy bantayanan nimo. So based from that, you have decided nga do not reject because again, it's either wala siya nag-fall sa rejection region or ang absolute value nimo is less than, absolute value sa imong computed Z is less than the absolute value sa critical value. So after this is deciding, you now have to conclude. So sa conclusion, we can say that therefore, at 0.01 level of significance, there is not enough evidence to conclude that there is a decrease in the number of students who prefer male rather than female. So, ang problema lang dito is wala man, sa given na to, wala tay problem. So, dili kayo kuha ng conclusion. Hindi na to kayo ma-relate, kumbaga. So, sa decision lang sa tanga parte, wala man to na-present ang problem dun sa given good. Diretso raman siya o diretso siya given. Mga data lang, wala di problem. Okay. So, inato pag decide kung mag-reject ka or dili sa one. Similar lang gid kaayo. So, this time, by the way, katong process is using the critical value approach. This time, I will be presenting to you, bahapyaw lang, ang p-value approach. What is p-value? In critical value approach, a test statistic is compared with the critical value. However, in p-value approach, short for probability value, probabilities or areas are compared. P-value measures the consistency of the sample statistics with the null hypothesis. High p-values mean that sample results are consistent with the true null hypothesis, while low p-values are not consistent. If the value is small, again, if the p-value is small enough, we can conclude that the sample is so incompatible with the null hypothesis. Therefore, we can reject the null hypothesis for the entire population. So, ang p-value, ang i-compare nimo ani is dito sa imuhang sa significance gani nimo, sa alpha nimo, I mean. So, dili siya di pareha ang critical value, i-compare nimo sa imuhang computed value. Ang sa p-value approach, ang p-value niya, i-compare nimo sa imong alpha. So, same ra ang process. First is you state the null and alternative hypothesis. Second, mag-set kag level of significance. Third is to calculate the test statistic. Diri lang siya mag-differ sa ika-fourth. Kaya ika-fourth nimo sa critical value, you will determine the critical value using the table. But diri, you will calculate the p-value. Usually, ang nag-calculate ana, kana na mga software na to, statistical software na. So, lastly is to make decision whether to reject or not the null hypothesis. So, in critical value, again, atong kuani siya, kung critical value approach ta, mao ni ang basis na to. If the absolute value of the Z computed siya is greater than or equal to the absolute value of the Z nga critical value or Z tab, diha ka mag reject HO. Otherwise, do not reject. That is for critical value approach. Kabaliktaran siya sa p-value approach. Kaya kung sa p-value approach, if ang p-value is less than your alpha, diha ka mag-reject. Otherwise, do not reject. So, again, kabaliktaran ang p-value. Kaya kung less than siya sa imong alpha, diha ka mag-reject. At sa critical value mango, dapat greater than or equal ang computed nimo sa imong critical value. So let's have an example. Say for example, we have here given data na HO is P is equals to 0.5, HA is P is greater than 0.5, then your alpha is 0.05, sample size na to is 25,468. Then, using the formula, na-compute niya na ang Z is 5.48 o 5.49. Using our P na 0. Asa ni gikan si P hat? Actually, given. Say for example, given na ni. Ang point lang na to is how to decide na using p-value approach. So, nakuha na niya ang Z na 5.49. So, kung tanaw na to ang Z na 5.49, kung pangitaan ang katong computed value nimo, pangitaan na nimo p-value. Kung say p-value, aning computed value nimo nga 5.49. Usually, pag nakay magamit niya ang statistical tool, encode nimo ang data, mulabas na mangguna ang mga p-value. Then, ang p-value aning 5.49 is approximately, actually that 0.00 nago na value pero taas kay na napasiguro ni mga numbers niya, which is approximately equal to 0. So, kung atong i-compare siya, this is 0 comparing to our alpha, which is, sa itong alpha na to, 0.05. So, 0 compared to 0.05, that is less than. So, since less than siya, again, using the p-value approach, kung less than siya, you have to reject the null hypothesis. So, yun. So, to conclude, we have here, because the p-value is smaller than the significance level na 0.05, we can reject the null hypothesis. So, again, we would say that there is sufficient or enough evidence to conclude. So, depende kung unsa tong problem na involved. So, ana, mag-conclude, mag-base ka sa imong decision pod. So, that is how to use the p-value approach. So, ang difference lang again kay p-value approach, kung less than imong p-value sa imong alpha, reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, do not reject. While sa critical value approach, dapat ang computed z-value nimo must be greater than or equal to your critical value para ka maka-reject. So, i-plaster na lang na sa inyong mga utot. Okay? And other illustrative examples, kani? Again, ang focus lang nato is decision dire. So, given tag data na n equals to 50, alpha na to 0.01, natay alternative hypothesis na p equals to 0.85, null. Ang alternative is p is not equal to 0.85. Then, given tag p-value. So, based sa p-value, you try to decide. So, p-value na to is 0.7554. So, using that one, kung sa'y decision nimo. So, again, you simply have to compare your p-value to your alpha. So, 0.7754 is what compared to your 0.01. So, klaro nga, greater than. So, kay greater than man siya, so, di ba, pag p-value approach, reject lang ka kung less than. So, meaning, you should not reject the null hypothesis. So, in conclusion, there is insufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. So, ato paggamit sa p-value. While kani is magamit po siya o critical value po ni. So, given ka, sample size nga 150, alpha na to is 0.05, null na to is p equals to 0.3, alternative na to is p is not equal to 0.3, p hat na to is 0.28, tapos naanadaan si computed nga 0.3478. So, ang kulang na lang, since critical value ni is kuha na to ang critical value niya. So, unsay critical value ani? Again, pag-determine sa critical value, we need to identify our alpha and unsa nga klase nga test. Since not equal atong alternative, meaning two-tailed ta. Two-tailed test. So, using the table, alpha again, pila to? 0.1. 0.1 na ara. Two-tailed na ara. So, intersection niya is positive and negative 1.64. So, nara ato ang critical value. While atong computed is 0.34, nara diri. So, klaro, nga wala, maumaning tani shaded, maumaning mga rejection region. So, naa siya sa non-rejection region. Ang aning computed na to. Since ang computed value, Z computed falls under the non-rejection region, you should not reject the null hypothesis. So meaning, there is insufficient evidence. There is insufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. So note, conclusions are answers in sentence form, which includes in ani dapat mag-conclude ha, dapat na whether there is enough evidence or not. So there is enough evidence or there is not enough evidence. Pwede po there is sufficient evidence or there is no sufficient evidence. So dapat na ato nga state na ato nga phrase sa imong conclusion. Tapos, the level of significance dapat nakasulat. At what level of significance? At alpha equals to 0.05. And lastly, whether the original claim is supported or rejected. So, dapat parehan eh. So, usulti kag there is insufficient evidence to support. Pwede ka, it's either to support or to reject. So, just take note na ang i-support nimo is ang alternative. Ang i-reject nimo is ang null hypothesis. So, para mas masabtan, mas maplastar sa utok, yung ani mag-conclude. So, ang first nimo buhaton, dapat sa imong between sa imong null o alternative hypothesis, dapat imuha siyang i-label, kumbaga. Butangan nimo label kung asa si claim. Kung naa ba sa HO or nasa HA ang claim. Kaya kung, again, ang HO, si HO man imong i-reject, si HA ang imong i-support. Kung ang claim nimo is H again, pag ang decision nimo is do not reject, insufficient pwede mong gamiton nga word. So, example ani. Say for example lang ha. Example nimo diri ka kani imong claim. Ang claim nimo is ang HO. Tapos ang imong decision is reject HO. So dapat imong conclusion is in this form. There is sufficient because reject man ka og HO, again na, kani nga form, kung nag-reject ka og HO na claim. Claim ang HO, pero gi-reject nimo sa HO. So, ang imong conclusion, there is sufficient evidence at alpha level of significance, depende, to reject the claim that blah, 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 blah. So, kani ang form. What about same gyapon? Ang kani, unsa po ni? Kani is, you do not reject HO na claim pod ang HO. Again, this time, claim si HO gyapon, pero ang conclusion, ang decision nimo is do not reject. So, pag-ingan ang situation, ang imuhang gamiton is there is insufficient evidence at alpha equals to blank to reject the claim. So, yung anak pod mag-conclude. Again, do not reject HO ang decision, tapos claim imong HO. Yung anak siya. What if ang claim nato is HA? Ang claim is nasa HA. Tapos, nag-reject kag HO. Ang decision nimo is reject HO, pero ang claim is HA. So, ingani pod ang pagka-conclude. Hanggang na, nag-reject kag HO, tapos ang claim sa problem is HA. So, pag ingani ang situation, you conclude by saying there is sufficient evidence that there is sufficient evidence at alpha equals to blank to support the claim. Kaya again, ang ginasupport na to is ang alternative man. And lastly, kanina part, ang scenario ani is do not reject imuhang conclusion, pero ang claim nimo is HA. So, kanipod ang format. There is insufficient evidence that at alpha equals to blank to support the claim. So, nato pag-conclude properly, kumbaga. So, medyo libog siya at first actually, pero i-plaster lang na sa inyong una. Take note, you reject or do not reject HO, tapos ang i-reject ninyo si HO, ang support ninyo is claim. So, ana lang. Okay? I think that's all for Quarter 4, Module 13, entitled Drawing Conclusions about Population Proportion Based on Test Statistic Value and Rejection Region.